As already noted, the book of Acts presents reaching out to the Gentiles as the logical step in gradual broadening the scope of eschatological redemption, in accordance with biblical prophecies and building upon the earlier success vis-à-vis the Jews in the land of Israel. We also saw that the narrative takes care to retain the position of the Jews within the movement as the central pillar of the Messianic community. While discussing chapter 9, we paid attention to our author's intent to locate Paul's initial preaching, in contradistinction to Paul's own letters, in the synagogue of Damascus. We will see now that this will remain the strategy also further on. Describing Paul's mission in the Hellenistic diaspora, the narrative of Acts will repeatedly emphasize that Paul habitually proclaimed his message in the synagogues. It is actually there that he encountered the Gentiles who, following Paul's preaching, would become Jesus' followers. Chapter 13 in the book of Acts is a telling example of that stratagem. I read starting from verse 13. Now Paul and his company came to Antioch of Pisidia, and on the Sabbath day they went into the synagogue and sat down. After the reading of the Torah and the prophets, the rulers of the synagogue sent to them, saying, Brethren, if you have any word of exhortation for the people, say it. So Paul stood up and motioned with his hand, said, Men of Israel, and you that fear God, listen. Paul's coming to the synagogue on Sabbath is mentioned as self-evident. This is what a traveling Jew would be expected to do on arrival to a new city, to seek the company of his brethren. And of course, Antioch, now in Turkey, had a large Jewish population. One also notes the author's awareness of what was supposed to happen during the Sabbath synagogue service. First, reading a portion from the Torah, then additional passages from the prophetic section of the scripture, and afterwards a sermon. Here Paul, as a guest, is asked to deliver the sermon. The book of Acts is among our earliest witnesses for this basic arrangement that survives until today. And this is one of many cases when New Testament sources provide an early evidence for broader Jewish tradition. We already talked about the function of protagonists' speeches, a favorite stratagem of the authors in those days. The opening address of Paul's sermon is most telling, especially if we compare it with Peter's address to his Jerusalem audience at the beginning of the book. There it was all about the people of Israel, but here we encounter a mixed audience, Jews and God-fearers. This is our author's foundational idea we already mentioned. Non-Jews attracted to Judaism, the God-fearers, who without undergoing circumcision and embracing Jewish dietary laws, frequented that synagogues in the diaspora on Sabbath days. Unlike the story of Cornelius, where such a Gentile God-fearer was a kind of isolated case in Caesarea, here it is portrayed as a broad phenomenon. The narrative of Acts continues with its conservative approach, claiming that in fact Paul initially did not go to look for Gentiles, but encountered them in the synagogues. In other words, it is not him who let the Gentiles in, but the early and broader Jewish missionary activity, which was totally unconnected to the Jesus movement. There is scholarly debate concerning the historical reliability of a massive God-fearers' presence in diaspora synagogues. It may be that the author amplified it, but it is difficult to imagine that he invented something completely unrecognizable to his intended readers. You were asked to read the whole chapter, and I believe you remember the highlights of Paul's sermon. It stands to reason that the author made Paul proclaim the main tenets of early Christian outlook that we have been discussing. Let me only highlight the emphasis on God's promise to Israel being fulfilled in Jesus, the Messiah, as the ultimate representative of the people. And what is that promise? When we read in Acts 13:26, Brethren, sons of the family of Abraham, and those among you who that fear God, to us has been sent the message of this salvation. For those who live in Jerusalem and their rulers, because they did not recognize him nor understand the utterances of the prophets, which are read every Sabbath, fulfill this by condemning him. But God raised him from the dead, and we bring you the good news that what God promised to the fathers, this he has fulfilled to us, their children, by raising Jesus, as also it is written in the second Psalm, "You are my son, today I have begotten you." On the other hand, as the reference to the Psalm of David's intronization indicates, the promise Paul speaks about is clearly that of Davidic messiahship. It's on the one hand. On the other hand, it is not about Davidic kingdom, but about resurrection. We already saw in the second chapter of Acts how the author subdues the political aspects of David's messiahship, presenting David instead as the prophet of future resurrection. It is resurrection that is now viewed as the sure blessings of David. It's verse 34. As for the fact that he raised him from the dead, no more to return to corruption, he spoke in this way, "I will give you the holy and sure blessings of David." Until now, no specifically Hellenistic motifs have been introduced. Even when in the diaspora, Paul in Acts stays with a line of messianic thinking inherited from the land of Israel's setting. We will continue next time.